Yay Networks.
Everyone has a different metabolic profile, and the different foods that you eat, exercise, sleep, and stress all play into your overall health and longevity. So being able to recognize how you're responding and making these modifications so that you can, optimize your health in the long run is very impactful.
A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. This week's episode of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition is about a topic that sounds maybe a little sciencey and complicated. We're talking about continuous glucose meters. And you may be like, I don't have diabetes. I don't need to pay attention to this. Y'all, this is absolutely fascinating. I've mentioned it just briefly in a few recent podcasts that I've experimented with this with myself, and I cannot wait to share this with y'all. And I actually have registered dietitian Molly Downey with me. She is really expert in this topic, and she's walked me through some of the questions I had about myself personally, but I want to share with y'all what this is all about. So basically, continuous glucose meters, the brand that I've used is NutriSense, and you've probably heard they have sponsored this podcast in the past, and they have done typical podcast sponsorships, which are about, 60-second ads. They are not sponsoring this podcast. So this is an entire podcast dedicated to continuous glucose meters because I think it's a really cool topic that I loved learning about. I loved seeing how my body responded to very specific foods and timing of foods, and how my body responded to exercise and what my glucose levels, my blood sugar levels were doing with this. It was absolutely fascinating. So as part of them sponsoring the podcast for the normal kind of 60-second spot, they send a sample product. So I got to use it, and I was like, wait, I was like just hooked and just enthralled with it. So this is not sponsored content. This is not something that they're paying myself or our other Molly here, our other registered dietitian Molly, to talk about. This is something that we are just really excited about, enthusiastic about, and want to share with y'all. So with that, welcome, Molly. I'm excited to have you joining me.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here as well. As you mentioned, I am one of the nutrition managers at NutriSense. We are a health technology company. We leverage continuous glucose monitors as a way to provide individualized insight into a person's metabolism, so you can actually see exactly what's going on with response to different variables, such as the foods that you're eating or the exercise you're doing, if you're experiencing any stress or poor sleep quality. All these different things are expressed in the glucose data, and it's super, super fascinating to be able to utilize this technology to help improve on everyone's metabolic health. So what actually happens is, for just more context on anyone who doesn't understand what the continuous glucose monitor is, it's just a sensor that is placed on the back of your arm. And what it does is it picks up on your glucose readings for a 24-hour period for 14 full days. So instead of just going to the doctor's office and getting one single finger prick or measuring your glucose with a glucose meter from your local drugstore, then that's just one single snapshot in time. With the continuous glucose monitor, you're seeing all of the different trends and fluctuations that are occurring within your blood sugar throughout the day. So it's far more comprehensive and promotes better feedback for us in order to make positive behavior change in what we're consuming, how we're managing our stress, our sleep quality, and all these wonderful things. So
it gives us so much education about the types of foods that we consume. And I think a lot of people have, we have these preconceived ideas that we think certain foods we respond poorly to, or that we respond better to. And some people may say, if I eat fill in the blank, it could be a flavored sugary yogurt. It could be a certain maybe nutrition bar that's higher in natural sugars and, low in everything else. If I eat that, or if they had a bagel for breakfast, let's say, they know that if they eat that, they're ravenous shortly after. They're thinking this and they're pretty sure about this, but then this lets you see is that hunch correct? And on the flip side, there may be certain things that someone's avoiding because they think, oh, I don't want to have that high dose of carbohydrates, or I'm avoiding that because I'm trying to keep my blood sugar, my glucose levels stable. I don't want to have these spikes of, blood sugar and insulin levels. Whereas certain things may actually not be impacting your glucose levels like you think. So it can just give us a lot of clarity. And there may be things that we are specifically adding in that we may not realize we may not be tolerating them as well. And then there's other times that Molly and I will talk about that having that rise in glucose levels is not bad, especially after a workout, when you look at recovery and you're looking at, there's certain times that the timing can really matter. So kind of going back to what it looks like, I'm going to actually put this on my social media. I did a little video of me putting it on myself. And so
Nice.
It's sort of like a little spring that's inside of the applicator for it. So if you imagine, like, I think of like the person, if you're going through customs, or the passport agent that's like stamping your passport and it's like ba-dunk, and it's like that fast, like it's like that. And so there's a needle inside of this. It sort of looks like, we also have a stamper at home that has our return address on it. That's like a reusable self stamper thing. It kind of looks like that. But inside of that, there's the little needle, and it's like a circular disc with a needle coming out of it, but it's all inside of this contraption. You don't really see it. You just place it on your back of your arm. And again, sort of like if you were stamping a document. And then as soon as you put a little bit of pressure, it's a very, very quick, it's a quick spring release. And so that needle is going to the back of your arm, but you don't even really feel it. It feels to me less than you would feel if you did a finger stick. And so now you have this like little plastic white disc that's in the back of your arm. And the NutriSense has these really cool stickers that cover it. They're like fabric stickers, and they are black, and they have a little bit of green writing on it that says like NS with NutriSense. And I didn't mind walking around with that for a month. I mean, it definitely was something. If I was going to like a nice event and wore a sleeveless outfit, my husband would have been like, take that thing off, like glucose monitors coming off for now. But for just normal walking around, it didn't feel awkward to me.
Yeah.
And then that little plastic disc syncs with our iPhones. And so you've got that in there, and then you actually just kind of you kind of wave your iPhone, you download the app, you wave your iPhone kind of in front of it, and you can feel it kind of, for me, my phone kind of would like vibrate when it caught the information. And then the next thing I can look at it, and it's showing me, it stores up to about 8 hours of data in that little plastic device. And so I can look, and if I'm doing it several hours through the day, or even just a couple of times through the day, I can see exactly, like Molly was saying, what happened, not just one snapshot, but literally looking at almost a bar graph. Not almost, it is a bar graph that the app generates for you. And you can see your timing. So then you also enter your exercise, your food, all the different parameters around it. So you can really see how it's like your food log overlaid with your glucose log.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, I think you did a great explanation of walking through what happens when you're actually applying the sensor. I think it's most of us are fearful that for that first time.
Right. It's
applying
intimidating.
that sensor, yeah, it is intimidating. But it's important to note that it does not hurt. And once it's in there, you're kind of like, oh, sweet. You're good to go. And that needle that is in the applicator, it does not stay inside of you. It's a microfilament that picks up on your blood sugar. So I think that's something that a lot of people may be intimidated by, but just knowing that that's not actually staying inside of you as well. But yeah, it's a great aspect that you're able to apply all that data into our app, and you see it all in graph form. So everything's represented for that entire 14-day period, or however long that you are hoping to be wearing the CGM device. But even if you take a 6-month break in between, you still always have access to all that information in your app. So it's nice for a comparison if you just want to do, periodic check-ins to see how you're doing, if you've experienced any change in your glucose or what's going on there. and moving from there. And I think you also brought up earlier, which I wanted to touch on, is the aspect of the fact that there's so much nutrition knowledge out there, and so many people may be fearful of carbohydrates or specific foods. And it's really comes down to the fact that everyone is so individualized, and where you might have a response to a specific food and I may have a response to a specific food, they can be completely different. So it's learning it to understand your personal body and how you are personally responding to these specific variables, and then making those modifications and adjustments from there. So I think if there is any fear of a specific food, and then you go and you test out your blood sugar and you're able to recognize, oh wow, this actually didn't promote the large response that I was looking for. I think that's encouraging too for promoting more flexibility in your diet if you are someone who's fearful of integrating different foods into what they're doing. So
it was interesting because one of the things, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I typically, the things that I reach for snacks through the day typically are more savory. I'm not a big sweet tooth person, but at night, a lot of people after dinner, you kind of want something like that one little thing sweet. And so I had recently done a segment and a podcast on some of the newer types of like gluten-free, lower carb cookies on the market. So I had just an assortment of these in the pantry already. Yeah. And so I would have like one or two of these a night, and it was completely fine. I would have had any client, yes, that's fine. What was interesting is they all were marketed. They all naturally were just gluten-free, which happened to be, but they all were marketed as, some variation of keto. But of course, keto is not regulated, it's keto friendly or keto approved or whatever. And I don't personally follow keto. That's not an approach that I do. However, at night, I don't want to have a big carb load right before I'm going to sleep, because I don't want to have that rise in glucose levels, insulin levels, that would be a spike in glucose as I'm sleeping, if I can avoid it. And so I normally would not reach for something that would be, I don't know, a bowl of pasta at night, or something that would just be a really carb heavy thing at night. What was really interesting though, is even within those different brands of air quote, like low carb or keto cookies, there was 2 varieties that I had, and I would have 1 or 2 a night, because I, again, had a pantry full of them for this other project we had done with them. And they were raising my glucose levels. And we can talk about fasting, like normal fasting levels would be like 80 to 120. They were raising it to 147, sometimes 150s. And then it was staying like that hours into my sleep. And then it would come down maybe at 2 a.m. and then go back up. And I was like, wow. So then I switched, and I'm not going to say which brands because I don't want to be negative about those brands. I do think they're still good products, but they were not local. They responded that way. The brand, and I will say this brand is called High Key, and they're at Costco. They're at places like Whole Foods. They have what they call a quote keto cookie. And that was one that it had 0 effect, 0 spike. And so I thought, well, that's one that I'll do because it's usually pretty close to bedtime. It's not 3 hours before bedtime. It's sort of like right as I'm winding down. I don't know. It's that like I'm tired, and it's kind of like the psychological, emotional treat. Yeah. So then I was like, okay, that was very eye-opening to me. So when I do just like a couple of little high key cookies, very, very different than this other brand, but on the surface, they all look like they would be similar.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Yeah. You brought up a lot of great points. And for you were able to then identify which of the various treats are going to be the best suitable for you. Because if you are having that sweet tooth and you want to then also promote the best glucose response for, helping with your overnight values and fasting values and your quality of sleep, then it looks like you found one that's far more effective. And of course, you were able to actually recognize that through seeing the glucose data. And I think it's important to recognize as well that in the evening, we have a decreased insulin sensitivity, meaning that we're just far less we're less able to tolerate foods in general, but specifically carbohydrates. So you can eat a carbohydrate-rich food earlier on in the day and have a far better response than, say, if you eat it later on after dinner, right before bed, your body's going to have more difficulty processing that meal, and it can affect your overnight values and fasting values into the next day. So that's a common trend that we see in so many people's data, and it's very, very impactful to actually see that information. And as you were discussing with the different keto products, that's something very interesting to look at as well, because you're right. You'll go to Costco or any other big store and they are labeling keto on everything. But these are all snack items. And if you look specifically at the portion size of it, are you actually even eating that exact portion size? You're probably eating double to triple the amount. So in order to be in ketosis, for most people, it's keeping under around, 30 grams of carbohydrate per day. So if you're maxing out that threshold in just that single treat, then you're likely to be hitting that higher carbohydrate content per day. So it's likely that it can still promote that glucose response. And also there are sugar alcohols in these specific types of products. And it really just depends. Some people are reactive to it and some people are not. So I would just highly encourage everyone to test them out and see how you specifically respond to it. So yeah, and definitely time of day is a huge thing too.
And again, I'm kind of getting into the specifics, which I was thinking I would save for later, but I think it's just really interesting. And it's also things that I think that are tangible that our listeners can be like, okay, I can relate to that. Because otherwise it can feel really sciencey, some of the stuff that we'll be talking about. Let's take a minute to talk about NutriBullet, one of our partners for this week's episode. We have had our NutriBullet for years and we love it. We use it practically daily. If you're not familiar, NutriBullet is the easy to use, easy to clean blender. Their signature blending transforms fruits, veggies, nuts, and seeds into silky, nutrient-dense smoothies. And we recently tried NutriBullet's blender combo for the first time. And oh my gosh, y'all, it is wildly powerful in the best of ways. It's got everything that we know and love about the NutriBullet. Plus, it has the performance and capacity that you expect from a full-size blender. From refreshing smoothies and protein shakes to savory soups and dips, the NutriBullet truly does it all. And the NutriBullet blender combos 1,200 watts of power. Seriously, anything around that's like papers or anything light, it actually blows it around on the counter. The power makes it effortless to blend this wide array of fiber-rich produce. So go to NutriBullet.com. Use promo code FUELED for 20% off your order. Once again, that's NutriBullet.com using promo code FUELED for 20% off. One of the things that I noticed, I've also mentioned on this podcast for our listeners, that my husband has been teaching me tennis, and he's played his entire life. Like he doesn't remember even learning how. And then we've been together 25 years, and he's like, seriously, you couldn't have decided 25 years ago to pick this up? He decided now. He's like, you'd be really good now. But so for the past year, he's, I've been practicing a lot and really working on it. And it's a different level of, energy usage than what I'm accustomed to, because I used to be a runner, and now with hip issues, I'll do walking, or I might do a little bit of high intensity type, kind of circuit workout. But that anaerobic burst that tennis has, and that high intensity, that high power, and then coming back down and then up, down, and just that, and also the sustained high intensity of it, because we'll go, it might be an hour and a half. Yeah. There's a totally different type of an energy usage there. So using the continuous glucose monitor for that was really fascinating. So I have also shared on this podcast that I love kettle style, the pink Himalayan sea salt chips, kettle chips that are also at Costco. Love them. And so I was like, wow, what a perfect opportunity to have a handful or two of those is before I'm going to hit tennis, because of course I need carbs. That also has some fats. I might have a piece of cheese with it, but the kettle chips are going to give me that carbohydrate that I need. What I noticed was multiple times, and after about 3 times, I was like, I got to change this. But having what would be considered a full serving or serving and a half of those chips in the 30-minute window before going out to hit, and my glucose levels might be in the 110, 120 as we're starting out. And again, fasting is 80 to 120. 80 to 120, is that usually what y'all?
We usually do 70 to 90 is like
Okay.
optimal.
Yeah, for
and then
fasting.
Under 100.
Yes.
Yeah, for fasting values.
So in the middle of tennis, I would feel bottomed out. I would take my phone and scan the little NutriSense scanner. My blood sugars would be at 57 and 60. I'm like, no wonder I feel like I've got no juice in me. I've got no power. I've got nothing that's coming out of here. And I was just feeling like I was just really just like completely hitting that wall. And so after a few times of seeing this, and this is clearly those carbohydrates were picking me up quickly and then dropping my glucose down really quickly. And so I was basically, if for lack of like, I guess the visual would be like my body was like running through those carbohydrates really quickly. So even though you would think I'm going to go hit tennis, I have this high intensity exercise, I'm going to do a carb rich food like potatoes in the form of these chips that I'll have before. And the fact that they were potato chips and had some fats, I was like, well, that'll slow down the digestion. In theory, it seemed fantastic. So what I switched to instead was an almond flour tortilla, which still has some carbs in it, but it's a lot lower carb. And I melt a piece of cheese on it, like full fat cheese. And the carbs of that snack are probably a third of what I was having with the chips. Yet my glucose levels stay strong the entire time through. And so it was counter to what I would have thought. If I was telling someone, you're about to go have this high intensity exercise, let's reach for a carb rich snack. What's your favorite? Let's plan for this. Let's incorporate it in there before. And that'll help fuel and sustain that exercise. You would not think, let's go with a lower carb tortilla with cheese and that would actually sustain glucose levels better. But yeah, for me, it does. And so that was, again, like when we're talking about, this goes way beyond someone who has, pre-diabetes or diabetes. This is for anyone who's looking to see, how do you respond to different foods in different circumstances?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good example of just, again, that personalization. So everyone, especially with workouts and higher intensity workouts, it really just comes down to exploration and experimentation. So I never have one defined tactic that's going to work for everyone. That's just not the way it works. So it comes down to actually testing out different foods and seeing how you feel, seeing what's happening to your blood sugar. And, if you're having any adverse effects, like as you were saying with the chips that you were eating, maybe that's not the best option then. And, we describe it as reactive hypoglycemia. So what we'll see in the data is you'll see a big spike, and then you'll see it then drop down very rapidly to lower glucose levels. So you might see this and experience no symptoms, but if you are seeing this represented in the data, and then you are feeling symptoms like, extreme hunger or fatigue or dizziness, you're just not feeling fully like yourself, then that's very, very impactful to see that represented in the data. And then you can, again, make those adjustments from there, as you said, with adding in that tortilla, and you found something that works more efficiently for your body. So
it also validates how you feel. I felt like, wow, I don't have any juice left, but do I? Is it just in my head? Am I not pushing through as much? And then it validates, no, you don't have any juice left, And so, it helped to kind of understand that performance there. Have you used them yourself, the continuous glucose monitors? Like, kind of, have you had experience that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I've worn plenty. I got super interested in them because before I even knew what a CGM was, I was just doing the finger pricks.
And we should say CGM is short for continuous glucose monitors.
Yeah.
So if it's okay with y'all, we'll say CGM interchangeably without explaining it every time, but it's easier to say.
Yeah, it's way easier to say. But yeah, I was doing tests on myself with a glucose meter because I wasn't feeling my best. I was experiencing skin issues, brain fog, fatigue, and I was eating pretty much a very high carbohydrate diet. I was not including a lot of quality protein or animal-based products because at that time I was very, focused on more of that plant-based lifestyle. And again, I was going to different doctors and trying to identify what was going on because I wasn't feeling good. And I was circled back to the thought that what if there's something that I can start to identify with my blood glucose? So as I started testing, I was able to realize that my fasting levels were higher than optimal, and my postprandial or post-meal responses were not optimal as well. So this was just eye-opening for me because I always thought, okay, I eat very well. I grew up very active. I played sports my entire life, and something just was not working for my body. So when I was able to identify these things, and then of course when I started to test out the CGM, it was just mind-blowing to me. So anytime I ate something like even oatmeal, like you might eat oatmeal and have a great response, but when I ate it, I had a spike beyond threshold. So the threshold that we mark is 140 milligrams per deciliter. And that's just where we're at currently with the science. So I was going up to like 160, 170, and I did not feel good after either. I would find my glucose levels were crashing. So again, it's the same realization that you were having, I was having as well. It's like,
with something that you would think, should be really well received by your body.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really interesting because when I tested out the oatmeal and had that poor response, then I did it again at another time after a workout, and I was able to tolerate it far more effectively. So it was not as poor of a response.
Yes.
So what happens in that post-workout period, it is a good time to consume carbohydrates because we're more insulin sensitive and have a better tolerance for carbohydrate at this time. So it's a really, really good time to actually eat those things. So it's interesting seeing that discrepancy.
So those chips that I keep saying that I love, like then for me, that also indicated to me that, okay, when I'm looking at post-workout for recovery, because our bodies are at that point really like soaking up the carbohydrates and using these to replenish those stores that have just been used up. And so like Molly was saying, that oatmeal had a much lower response for her after a workout. For me, the chips also did. And then it's like, well, all right, instead of having them before, that'll kind of be my treat after, because I do love them. And like, when can I fit chips in a time that actually is purposeful? Talk to us about, so the window, so if someone is experimenting with a continuous glucose monitor, and we'll say like, I love NutriSense, I love the app that goes with it. There are other brands, we'll say that, but what we're talking about is my experience with NutriSense, and I've been really happy with it. We also have, and I'll make sure that it's still active, but we have the promo code that NutriSense had done when they sponsored the other podcast. So I'll put the link to that in this one too. But like we said, this is not sponsored content. This is us just sharing with y'all, but we just want to kind of walk you through it. So if someone's doing that, and you put on the sensor, as we talked about, then you connect your app to it and you kind of activate this. The next step is, if you have access to a glucose meter, you would actually calibrate your glucose monitor. And so for mine, it was running a little high. Oh, the thing I've completely forgot to mention, another reason I love NutriSense, is you have one-on-one dietitian support. So Molly is a registered dietitian, but she has a team of dietitians that work with people one-on-one. So I had access to one dietitian who was continuously in touch with me throughout the entire time that I had the glucose meter on. And she would check in, she would note things. She was looking at my data and then giving me feedback on it, like in very close proximity of time. So for me, that was also incredibly appreciated. And so I was like, oh my gosh, everything's running a little high. She's like, well, calibrate it. And so what that meant was getting a glucose meter, which my neighbor had. I didn't have one at my house, and doing it at a time that I was kind of chill and there wasn't going to be any fluctuations. I wasn't eating anything for just that immediate window. And I scanned my glucose meter with my phone or the continuous glucose monitor in my arm, scanned that to see, okay. And it was kind of hovering in the same, let's just say 89 for those purposes. And it was there for a while. And so then I did a finger stick with a glucose meter, just the old school glucose meter. And I saw where that was. And then it was about a 10-point difference. And so in the settings in NutriSense, it allows you to adjust and basically calibrate it. So you're able to dial it back by 10 points. So what that meant was I was able to align what was in my arm with what the glucose meter showed. And so I checked it maybe another time or two to just make sure it was still in alignment and that it hadn't been a blip, and it was. And so that's something that if you do have access to a glucose meter, if not, the dietitian who's working with you can also help to kind of guide and give you a ballpark of how you can calibrate it without a glucose meter. So once you have that, then you set your parameters, and you said that the upper limit usually set is about 140. And so anything that you eat, if your glucose levels are under 140, and they're in that kind of target window, the chart is giving you a green. It looks green. And then anything that's above that 140 is showing up as yellow. And so explain to us kind of like what that means, of what those parameters mean, kind of the low end and the high end, and why those are set, and how to interpret that if you're wearing one.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of good points there. And we're looking at the different parameters because, for example, if you eat a specific meal, then you will watch your blood sugar respond to that meal. So it's normal to have a spike from something, but we're just hoping to stay in more tight regulation within the body. So as I said, we have that peak threshold at 140. The reason we don't want to be consistently above this threshold for extended periods of time is because when we're in these higher ranges, this is a stressor on the body. It can promote inflammation, cellular damage, and oxidative stress, which can further promote more adverse effects and, promote more disease down the road. So if you do have a spike and it does go beyond threshold, we just are hoping that it comes back down within a 2 to 3 hour period. So a less ideal response would be if you hit those high levels, say 180, and your levels are sitting up there for 3-4 hours, there's likely more damage going on within the body. So we can work on ways, with your dietitian to help optimize those responses. It doesn't mean that you can never have that food again.
Right.
There are many different modifications that you can work with your dietitian on to help optimize that response so that you're comfortable consuming that food. Or if it's still not working out after the modifications, you can look for some alternatives from there. But we understand that the glucose data is a bit more complex than a lot of people fully understand. So that's why we offer that dietitian support to help the individual assess the data and, move forward from there to help optimize their health. So, and as you mentioned with calibration, I calibrate my sensor, usually on day 2 or 3 after I place it. It's just something that comes along with the CGM. There, of course, are imperfections, but I look at it from the positive aspect that we've come such a long way with the CGM and this technology. And I'm excited for what it's going to be 10 years down the road from now, right? Yeah, so it's like type 1s it's completely revolutionized their life and the information that they're able to see from it. And I know it'll only improve from here. So yeah, the calibration is kind of just a part of it.
And so to kind of recap on that, once you have the sensor applied, if possible, you'll calibrate it with just an old school glucose meter. Like Molly said, you can get them at the drugstore or your next door neighbor, like I did. Or you can work with your dietitian who's assigned to you, and they can kind of guide you on how you can manually calibrate it. And that threshold typically is set to where 140 is the upper. So for me, when I was seeing anything that was bringing me above 140, so those low carb, quote, keto kind of style cookies at night were bringing me to 147, 150s. That was showing a spike in the yellow range, like the warning range. So it kind of just gives you this visual. And like Molly was saying, when we're continually elevated like that, we're looking at an increase in inflammation, oxidation, that cellular damage. And so also, as you've heard us talk about, this doesn't mean that we can never have that rise in glucose. So if you're able to have that rise in glucose and your body's bringing it down fairly quickly, that's not a bad thing. Also, if it's right after a workout, that can be a really desirable thing. Athletes always are looking at what's my post-workout recovery, and that's the effect that they're looking for. Like, we actually want to have that spike post-workout to help better support muscle recovery and repair after a workout. So learning all of these things and kind of understanding the nuances of this, and then having that dietitian access through email is really fantastic. You mentioned earlier that people tend to tolerate carbohydrates less well, I guess more poorly at night than they do during the day. And I would think a lot of that might be due to, while we might not necessarily think of ourselves as exercising through all the time throughout the day, we're having movement. Whether it's running errands or going to the grocery store, just doing things around the house, picking things up, unloading our car. That movement and moving our muscles and that activity is helping with bringing those glucose levels down. Whereas at night, a lot of times I know for me, after 9 p.m., you're largely sedentary. You're either maybe watching something on TV. You hopefully aren't still at the computer, but a lot of people still are having whatever technology, or you're laying down in bed. Most of us after 9 o'clock aren't really doing much physical movement. Let's talk for a minute about Headspace, one of our partners for this week's episode. If you sometimes feel like your brain just doesn't have that off switch, those thoughts just keep swirling and swirling, or you're feeling tired or just run down no matter how much you sleep, these are just some of the many ways that anxiety can impact our mind and our body. So consider making small changes to your daily routine that can have a tremendous influence on our mental health and well-being. Turn to Headspace for support. Headspace has data behind it supporting that it can help us manage our feelings, manage our mental health. Whether your goal is to relieve stress and anxiety, sleep better, or improve your focus, Headspace is your everyday dose of mindfulness for real life. Using the app for just a few minutes each day has helped me feel better, letting go of that swirl of thoughts, helping to be more present. One of my favorites is Headspace's appreciation course. It helps to keep us dialed into what really matters. So however you're feeling, try Headspace at headspace.com/fueled and get 1 month free of their entire mindfulness library. This is the best Headspace offer available. So go to headspace.com/fueled today. That's headspace.com/fueled.
Movement plays a huge part in how we're processing the meals at night, and also just how we have evolved as humans and our circadian rhythms and just how hormones are operating at that time. So we're just less tolerant of these types of foods and what's going on. But yeah, even we've had plenty of people do experiments where they're sitting all day at their desk versus if they're standing up all day. And there's significant improvement just from even standing up. So never underestimate the smallest, slightest aspect of movement or just going for a quick walk, because it's truly, truly impactful and very helpful in the long run.
I have these physical therapy moves that I do for just like hips and lower back issues that I have. And they're really small micro moves, but I would see that improvement in glucose, that drop in glucose, even from that. And it is not anything that's like really what we would consider intense. Also, when we're talking about like the timing of when we eat foods, and this was interesting. You had mentioned to me kind of in our pre podcast huddle that, y'all will have people do experiments, kind of like you said, if you're sitting versus standing, and people kind of do experiments. And then within a meal, like, let's have a meal where same meal, and then, a few times you're having that protein first, then the veg, then the carb. So if you're having, let's say, salmon and broccoli and a sweet potato, you're having the salmon first, then the broccoli, then the sweet potato, doing that and seeing how that affects it. And then another day having that same meal and reversing it. What happens if you eat the sweet potato first, then the veg, then the protein? And even just having that protein and veg first is going to help buffer that reaction, that response.
Yeah, exactly. I think you mentioned a lot of great ways for modification and experimentation. And, as you said, if you test out a specific food, you have a poor response, test it out in the same situation the next day, same time, and see what happens. If you add in protein this time, does it blunt your response? Then for you, that may just be your go-to then moving forward. So instead of just eating a banana, for example, what happens if you pair it with, a hard-boiled egg or peanut butter, something that's going to promote a more optimal response for you? And, even if you test out the same thing and going for a walk afterwards. So walking is largely beneficial for improving glucose levels after you eat something. So it helps dispose of that excess glucose and allows for your levels to return back down to baseline values in a more effective manner. So I try to go for a walk after most of my meals, especially at night. When we're having more difficulty processing these foods, even just going for a quick walk around the block with someone in your family
5-10
or a
minutes.
dog, it does not need to be anything
Right.
drastic. It's just a quick walk, and that's very, very helpful.
It's also really good for our mental mindset.
Yeah.
On adding the things like you said, see what order, if it's protein first, then veg, then carb. One of the things that we're always saying is, okay, what are the things this in general that are going to keep us fuller longer, that's going to promote sustained energy? Protein, fat, fiber. So what we don't want is just a bunch of white carbs, a bunch of pretzels or things like that, just a plain old white bagel. We want to layer in protein and fats, ideally plant-based fats, and fiber when we can. And that's just a very simple way of thinking it. But what you just heard Molly say is, okay, if you're having that carbohydrate and it's causing that spike, what happens if we put protein with it? What happens if we put fat or another type of fiber? Because those things, protein, fat, fiber, slow the digestion of that carbohydrate. They slow the entry of that carbohydrate into our bloodstream. And so it's really helping us to, and the glucose monitor lets us see the visual for that. And then the other things that I'll say, there's a few things that you might experiment with, especially someone who has type 2 diabetes. Things like apple cider vinegar before a meal might help with your response and glucose levels. Things like chromium picolinate or alpha lipoic acid. These are things that if we have someone with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, our dietitian team will start gradually incorporating these. And you could use something like the continuous glucose monitor to see this. And then, so what would you say, as we're kind of like wrapping up, if there's anything that we've missed that we want to make sure people are understanding about the importance of understanding this biofeedback that they're seeing, and then also just advice or guidance you would give us?
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot of great points, and hopefully I can kind of consolidate just tips to just take home moving forward. Even if you don't end up testing out a CGM at some point, you can still begin working with some of these tactics. So essentially, no naked carbs. So always pairing your carbohydrates.
I like that way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah. With protein, trying to consume your carbohydrates after a workout if you are anticipating that you're going to have a higher response from it. Encouraging your carbohydrates for earlier on in the day instead of at night. So most people are less tolerant at night. So even just sticking to low carb meals, that's just a protein, veggies, healthy fats. So that could be like salmon, avocado, and broccoli and asparagus, for example. So those lower carb meals at night can be very helpful in improving those overnight values. And then just going for a walk, keeping movement steady throughout the day is going to be very helpful just for your overall health, mentality, your glucose levels, everything. So just, any small movement is always going to be effective there. So yeah, just hopefully, these tips you can begin working with them. And hopefully if you do test out the CGM at some point, then you can just run some experiments on yourself and work with your dietitian to help, optimize.
So no naked carbs. So trying not to have naked carbs, meaning just the starch by itself or carb by itself, rounding it out with that protein, fiber, fat, as we said. Considering pulling back on those carbohydrates at night, especially if you do find that you're more sensitive to the effects of carbohydrates, and looking at them earlier in the day and looking at them especially after a workout to help with that muscle recovery, that muscle repair, and also understanding that our body is really ready to process and use those carbohydrates after a workout. Walking is tremendous, and we can do it anywhere. And again, it can just be 5-10 minutes after a meal. Trying to find some level of activity that we can do. And then with all of this, it's understanding that these are giving us, it's giving us insight. And it's not to say that we never can have those things, but it's understanding how we respond to it. And then it educates us. And then we're choosing later, do I want to have this at this time in this way, knowing the way that our bodies respond to it? Or is there something else I can find that brings me equal joy and is also really nourishing my body and keeping me much more steady and stable? So Awesome. I really appreciate this. Anything else that we want to say, or anything, resources that we want to share with our listeners?
No, it was great having this conversation. Hopefully it was helpful to your listeners to learn a little bit more about just the CGM, what it does, and how you can help improve your health moving forward. But you can follow us on social media. We have an Instagram, it's NutriSense.io. We have a website with excellent blogs if you're just curious and want to learn more information there. And we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook too. So check us out.
Yeah, I'll definitely link to the website and social. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time, Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Molly.
A tremendous thank you to registered dietitian Molly Downey for joining us. She's brilliant at what she does. She just has such an understanding of, all the intricacies, the nuances of using and just really maximizing our experience with something like a continuous glucose monitor. It's a fascinating, for me, wearing it was fascinating. It was educational. It confirmed some things that I thought I knew. It also enlightened me to things that I was wrong about. And so there's just so much that is general when it comes to nutrition, general that is just kind of general concepts, general applications. So something like this continuous glucose monitor concept really helps us to learn the individualities, how things truly apply to just us, how different scenarios affect us, our sleep, our stress, and especially what we're eating. And if you have the opportunity to experiment with a continuous glucose monitor, I would love to hear about your experience with it. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.